I'm going to start off and just break a rule of communication and give my big idea right off the bat. And that is that I believe that a synergy between faith and science will bring about the greatest breakthroughs of our generation. That a working together, a partnership of faith or a theistic worldview or religion and rigorous science will actually produce the biggest breakthroughs of the 21st century. And I've got just a few minutes to do that. Galileo was put on trial back in 1616 by Pope Paul V, and he was brought before the Roman Inquisition for his views on heliocentrism, for propagating this idea that the celestial bodies of our solar system revolve around the sun. Now, this stood in contrast to geocentrism, which had been mainstream science for almost 2,000 years up to that point, and was considered dogma by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Galileo had simply looked at Jupiter through his little telescope that he constructed and observed that there were moons orbiting Jupiter. But still, he was brought before the Roman Inquisition. He was condemned as a heretic. Eventually, he was placed under house arrest, and his famous work, Dialogue, was banned from publication. Now, almost 400 years later, none of us have a problem with the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but still this cultural battle wages between faith or religion on the one hand and science on the other. A lot of the rhetoric out there pits the two against one another like they're irreconcilable. And some people think we don't have the philosophical tools to bridge the gap anymore. But worst of all, at least to me, there are extremists on one end of the debate or the other whose goal is similar to that of the Roman Catholic Church at that time period, and that is to silence the opposition. My goal here today is not to convince you, if you're a scientist, to adopt some sort of specific religious worldview, or if you're of a specific religious persuasion, to adopt a certain scientific position. But what I do hope to do is to put a pebble in your shoe, to cause us all to walk away from today and this great event and to reassess our approach to this conversation, our approach to this dialogue, in an effort hopefully to pave the way to more fruitful discussion in the future. Because at the core of this debate is really an epistemological question. How do we know things? How do we really come to know something? You have science on the one hand, which is the observation of the universe, the systematic knowledge of the material world through observation and experimentation. And you have theology on the other hand, which is both observation of the natural, but then an attempt at an explanation of the supernatural. And you often have interpretation of spiritual texts. And so on the surface, it's easy to see why there would seem to be a gap between the two. People who doubt that they overlap at all, if they overlap in any certain way. But this gap hasn't always existed. There have been scientists throughout the centuries, scientists like Isaac Newton. And if you're a scientist here today, you might balk at the idea that faith has some sort of bearing, not just on your life, but even on your work. And most of us are familiar with the work of Isaac Newton, the profound impact that he's had on our world, breakthroughs in the areas of understanding gravity and the development of calculus and the laws of motion and understanding some of the properties of light. But not as many people are familiar with the fact that Isaac Newton was a deeply religious man as well. In fact, Newton wrote more about religion than he did about faith and science combined. And it was this belief in God, not just a belief in God, but a God who both created and sustains the world, that inspired him to break with other thinkers like Descartes and Spinoza, and to believe that if there's a mind behind the organization of the universe, then we should be able to mine out the laws that govern it. And I think if Isaac Newton was alive today, he would be confused by some of the conversations and the debates that are happening. It was largely that worldview that led Isaac Newton to believe that he could mine out those laws and led to many of those breakthroughs that I talked about. For him, faith and religion were two sides of the same coin. They were a seamless whole. His faith actually inspired his science and vice versa. And Newton's not the only one. There have been men and women of various faiths throughout the centuries from all kinds of different scientific disciplines who weren't just able to balance faith and science and to hold them in tension, but whose faith actually inspired their science. Time would fail us to tell of Sheikh Al-Tusi in the past, and then Dr. Ben Carson in the present. Men and women for whom faith and science were a seamless whole, like Isaac Newton, and who would believe that a synergy, a working together, will actually produce the greatest breakthroughs in our time. But still the debates rage on. You have debates on the macro level that deal with topics as broad and far-reaching as why are we here? How did this all begin? What sustains it? What happens after we die? But then you have more nuanced debates that are going on. Debates over embryonic stem cell research. Debates over the content of education in our public schools. And it doesn't take long if you listen to the debates or you watch them on YouTube to pick up on a generally negative tone. Not always, but generally a negative tone in the debates between religion and science. But it doesn't have to be this way. I believe it's the dogmatism on one end or the other of the faith and science divide that prevents us from coming together to have more of a conversation about how the two can overlap. See, science, on the one hand, deals with questions that probe the cosmic universe on the one end and the quantum on the other, but there might be other phenomena out there like beauty and art, like ethics and even love that may require another language to explain them. Literally, billions of people all over the world seem to think so. People from just about every culture. We have yet to discover a culture, a system of thinking that doesn't have some form of spirituality embedded in it. But again, it requires laying down the dogmatism, religious dogmatism on the one end, and scientific intolerance on the other. See, as I've traveled the world and sat down with religious leaders of just about every major faith, and as I've listened to and read various scientists from all different types of disciplines, I found a common thread that unites them all. And all of them claim on some level to be pursuing truth. And I think this is a tremendous talking point, a powerful talking point. These men and women are pursuing truth, and truth, by definition, should be able to stand on its own, right? So how honest is the faith that's not willing to ask the difficult questions? And how honest is the science that won't consider a viewpoint that might not be considered mainstream science? There's a quote by a late NASA astronomer who was himself an atheist, and he said something to this effect. He said, "It seems as though science may never be able to raise the curtain on the mystery of creation. As the scientist who's lived by his faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance, he's conquered the highest peaks, and as he pulls himself over that final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." And I think it's time for that band of theologians and that intrepid scientist to sit down together and have a conversation. Because it might take more than just the scientific method to understand the workings of our universe. It might take philosophers and theologians to sit down with those scientists to answer some of the biggest riddles that face us today. Augustine taught us that we can know a nation not by the size of its population or the strength of its armies or the prestige of its universities, but by what we love most supremely. And I would contend in America over the years that has been freedom, the thing that we love most supremely. So I would ask us today, how healthy are we as a nation if we're suppressing certain conversations from entering the public sphere in an effort to be politically correct? And Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and my prayer and my hope is that our generation would be a courageous one, who faces the difficult questions and who has the challenging conversations, and that you would go home with that pebble in your shoe and reassess your approach to this conversation as well. And that freedom of expression would once again echo through our institutions, and who knows what breakthroughs might follow if we're so bold as to have those conversations. Thank you.